The night grew heavier as the guardhouse settled into a silence so thick it pressed against Eli Carter's chest like a weight. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the mesquite and sage, carrying the scent of dust, fire, and distant rain. Inside, the oil lamp flickered, throwing long, trembling shadows across the wooden walls and the iron bars that separated him from the woman everyone called a savage. She sat chained at the ankle, her posture straight despite the rough stone beneath her, her dark hair falling like a curtain down her back. Eli had guarded prisoners before, thieves, killers, desperate men broken by their own choices, but none had ever unsettled him like her. It wasn't fear that gnawed at him. It was recognition, a strange pull he couldn't name. When she finally lifted her eyes, he felt it again, sharp and undeniable. There was no madness in her gaze, no animal rage like the stories claimed. There was grief. There was pride. And beneath it all, there was a quiet intelligence that made his stomach tighten with shame for every cruel word he'd heard spoken about her kind. He remembered how the soldiers laughed earlier that day, how they wagered how long it would take before she tried to bite or stab him. She had done neither. She had simply watched, memorizing the room, the sounds, the man tasked with guarding her life. Eli cleared his throat, trying to shake the thoughts away, telling himself this was just another job, another night earned for a few silver coins he badly needed. Yet his eyes kept drifting back to her bruised wrists, to the dried blood where the shackles had bitten into her skin. He found himself bringing her water without being told, setting it just within her reach. When their fingers brushed by accident, the contact sent a jolt through him, stronger than any bullet's recoil. She didn't pull away. Instead, she spoke softly, in broken English learned from missionaries or traders, each word careful, deliberate. She asked his name. The simple question stunned him more than any threat could have. No prisoner had ever cared who he was. He answered before he could stop himself. Eli, she repeated it slowly, tasting the sound, then gave him her own name, Aiyana. It meant eternal blossom, she said, her voice steady, despite the pain she carried. Eli swallowed hard. Savage, they called her, yet nothing about her felt wild or cruel. As the hours passed, the silence between them grew less hostile, filled instead with unspoken questions, and a growing awareness that something was deeply wrong with the story he'd been paid to believe. He noticed how she flinched at distant gunfire, not with fear but with anger, how her jaw tightened whenever soldiers passed by, laughing. When he asked why she'd been captured, she hesitated, then told him of her people driven from their land, of a raid where women and children were taken, of how she'd fought not to kill, but to protect. Each word chipped away at the lies he'd grown up hearing. Eli thought of his own past, of land stolen by richer men, of promises broken, of how easily the powerful crushed those beneath them and then called it justice. Somewhere between her quiet story and the creak of the guardhouse beams, a dangerous thought took root in his mind. She didn't belong in chains. And worse, he didn't belong on this side of the bars. The realization terrified him. Freeing her would mean betrayal. It would mean death if he were caught. Yet as dawn crept closer, painting the desert sky in pale blues and burning gold, Eli knew something inside him had already crossed a line. When Aiyana met his gaze again, there was no pleading there, only a calm understanding, as if she already sensed the storm raging inside him. He looked away, gripping his rifle, telling himself to remember the pay, the orders, the risk. But his heart no longer listened. By the time the sun rose fully, Eli Carter understood a truth that would change his life forever. Guarding her was easy. Letting her remain a prisoner would be the thing he could never forgive himself for. By the second night, the decision Eli Carter had tried so hard to bury was no longer a thought. It was a living thing, breathing inside his chest, growing heavier with every hour that Aiyana remained in chains. The fort had settled into its usual rhythm of arrogance and cruelty. Soldiers drank, laughed, and spoke openly about how the Apache woman would be transported at dawn, paraded as proof of victory before being sold, imprisoned, or quietly executed, depending on the mood of men who would never know her name. Eli listened from the shadows, His hands clenched so tight his nails cut into his palms. Each word felt like a hammer striking his conscience. When he returned to the guardhouse, he found Aiyana awake, sitting perfectly still, as if sleep itself had abandoned her. She did not ask questions. She only looked at him. And in that look was acceptance, not of her fate but of his struggle. It shattered him. Eli realized then that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the decision that something else mattered more. He waited until the fort sank into drunken sleep, until the torches burned low and the desert reclaimed the night. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure the wolves could hear it. With trembling hands, he unlocked the rifle rack, not to take a weapon, but to remove temptation. Violence would doom them both. He approached her slowly, whispering her name, and when he knelt to the shackles, his fingers hesitated only once before turning the key. The soft click echoed like thunder in his ears. Aiyana closed her eyes as the iron fell away, not in relief, but in reverence, as if honoring the weight that had just been lifted from more than her body. They moved like ghosts through the fort, Eli leading with memory and instinct, Aiyana following with the silent grace of someone born to the land. Twice they froze as soldiers stumbled past, laughing, blind to the truth slipping between them. At the edge of the fort, where the desert opened wide and merciless, Eli stopped. He knew he couldn't go back. Freedom once chosen erased all return. Aiyana touched his arm, not to pull him forward, but to give him a choice. He stepped into the desert. By dawn, the alarm rang out behind them. Gunshots cracking the air, men shouting orders, filled with rage and disbelief. They ran until Eli's lungs burned and his legs shook, until the desert swallowed the sounds of pursuit. When they finally stopped, hidden among red rock and sage, Eli collapsed to his knees, laughing and crying all at once. Aiyana stood before him in the rising sun, no longer a prisoner, no longer a myth. She was a woman who had survived hatred and chains, and a man who had chosen humanity over pay. In the days that followed, she guided him through the land as if it welcomed him for the choice he had made. He learned her people's ways, their stories, their grief, and their unbroken spirit. And when they reached her tribe, Eli expected judgment. Instead, he was met with cautious silence, then quiet respect, not because he was a hero, but because he had done what so few dared to do. He had seen the truth and acted. Years later, long after the fort had turned to dust, and the men who paid him were forgotten, the story remained. Not of a guard and a savage, but of two souls who refused to let lies define them. And as you listen to stories like this, stories of courage, redemption, and choices that change destiny, remember that every voice matters. Every truth deserves to be heard. If this journey moved you, if it reminded you that humanity survives even in the darkest places, stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and become part of a community that believes powerful stories still have the power to set us free.